Hello, comrades. Thanks for joining us tonight. We had a break last week, but it's good to see you all back. We are looking at William Hogarth and John Gaye, and specifically the Beggar's opera, and art as satire, presented by Ian Spencer. Thank you, comrade.
Good evening, comrades. Tonight is a bit of a labour of love for me. I have loved the paintings, in particular the engravings of William Hogarth for most of my life, and the ballad opera, The Beggar's Opera by John Gaye. Hogarth and Gaye were contemporaries, and there are numerous references to uh, in Hogarth's work to John Gaye, to the Beggar's Opera, and he actually painted a picture, as I'll show you, of a scene from the Beggar's Opera, and so I've included them together really as a kind of a way of looking at art as satire in 18th century Britain in general, London in particular. Because Hogarth and Gaye were both based in London, although Gaye wasn't originally from London. Um, so it's art as satire, but it's an interesting one as well because both William Hogarth and John Gaye, I would argue, were artistically radical, but conservative in their own politics. And I think it's an interesting illustration of the way in which an artist can achieve an objective which was not really part of their intention necessarily. I mean, there's nothing in William Hogarth's life story and in what we know about his political views that would suggest that he took a radical position. On the contrary, he lampoons the radical John Wilkes and makes another series of assertions. Quite clearly, he supported, for example, the Hanoverian cause against the Jacobite cause. He's clearly was very anti-French for reasons I'll come on to. So he was very patriotic. But nevertheless, I'm going to argue by looking in particular at the Rake's Progress that Hogarth's work has he was one of the people to have a kind of approach to realism that really held a mirror up to 18th century society, and in particular, the massive inequalities that existed in 18th century London. In a sense, William Hogarth is a bourgeois artist in the truest sense. I mean, he was the son of a relatively poor teacher of Latin, who himself had rather a kind of impoverished life. And at one point, his father had ended up in a debtor's prison. And you see some interesting parallels here with the life of Charles Dickens, of a life of relative poverty and of horror of the debtor's prison. So William Hogarth was actually born in Bartholomew Close, and if anybody knows London, that they know it's right near St Bartholomew's Hospital in Smithfield. So you've got Smithfield Meat Market, the nearby St Bartholomew's Hospital, and William Hogarth was born in Bartholomew Close. The proximity to St Bartholomew's Hospital is kind of ironic because later in his life, as a successful artist, one of Hogarth's greatest and biggest works adorns the staircase in part of St Bartholomew's Hospital, and it's the Christ at the Pool of Bethesda, and it's a magnificent picture, and I'll mention a little bit more about that later. So it was also unusual in another way, in that he didn't have the kind of approval of a portrait artist such as Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was very much part of the establishment. I'm not suggesting for one moment that William Hogarth was not part of the establishment, but in contrast to being knighted by the king, as Sir Joshua Reynolds was, William Hogarth had the relatively minor position of sergeant painter, but that was still quite a sinecure, which brought him in £1,000 a year, which was an astronomical sum of money at the time. So Hogarth, rather than having had a kind of very formal training in art, was apprenticed as an engraver. And later on, as we see, his financial income was more derived from his engravings than from his paintings. It's not that he didn't make any money out of his paintings. A painting he did of the actor Garrick, he received what was for then the biggest sum ever paid for an individual portrait of £200. And to put that into context, a kind of average worker's wage at the time was around £40 a year. So there he is, an engraver. He later on enrolled in a drawing school in Covent Garden. So and it was a drawing school which was actually went bust at one point. But nevertheless, he learned enough art to be able to be an accomplished painter as well as an engraver. He also had a hand in establishing copyright law. He was sick to death of the fact that he would do these engravings and then find people would just copy them. Um, he, um, he managed to persuade Parliament effectively to pass a law allowing for the copyright of works of art. So his works are satirical. They're satirical of all sorts of things. They're also morality tales. He satirizes, for example, parliamentary elections. He satirizes individual politicians. But above all, what you tend to see are these kind of morality tales that he offers. And again, it's this sort of bourgeois morality of it being industrious and hardworking, and then the rewards come to you. Whereas if you're lazy and feckless and spend your time in gaming halls and in brothels, you can expect only damnation and disease and all the rest of it. So he's presenting a social comment which is not inherently radical as such, but it does hold up, as I say, a mirror to the development of bourgeois society from a bourgeois perspective. And Hogarth is not condemning industry, far from it. He's praising it and lauding it. But what he also despises is the aristocracy. And you can see in a number of his pictures, in a number of his series, such as Marriage à la Mode, for example, where you see a contemptuous attitude towards the aristocracy. You will see it also in The Rake's Progress. So, as I say, he made his money out of the prints, really, as much as anything else, but he was also a pretty unorthodox portraiture painter. You see in this self-portrait here, the painter and his pug, and I only found out today the name of his dog was Trump. And Sir Joshua Reynolds, you could never have imagined Sir Joshua Reynolds painting a dog and not one sitting in the foreground in front of the subject of the painting. Uh, he also wrote books on aesthetics and this line of beauty. He wrote a number of sort of theoretical things on aesthetics, which didn't receive a great deal of attention at the time, or were actually derided, not least of which because he came from a relatively low class background. But as a portrait artist, I would argue that he is of his time second to none. I would prefer to look at one of Hogarth's portraits over Sir Joshua Reynolds any day of the week. When you get up close to them, you see a freshness in the brushstrokes and the rest that you just don't see in Reynolds' work. In Reynolds' portraits, there's a tendency to somewhat aggrandize, to make perfect the subject who's sitting for him. In the case of Hogarth, he tends to paint it as it is. And so from that point of view, Hogarth is interesting as someone who is embracing realism as an important feature of his art. This is Captain Thomas Coram, whose portrait he painted. One of the other aspects of Hogarth and a feature of his kind of moral stance was of support for charities. So Thomas Coram made a fortune as a sea captain and did what anyone would do, spent all his money on supporting abandoned children. Modern millionaires, please take note. so in Coram was absolutely horrified at the numbers of foundlings there were in London in particular. Children literally just left on the doorsteps of churches or wherever else, and so he founded the Foundling Hospital, and in London, not far from Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, there is Thomas Coram's Fields, which wasn't far from where the Foundling Hospital stood. The Foundling Hospital also has a museum in London. So Hogarth was happy to support the Foundling Hospital. He painted his great picture at St Bartholomew's Hospital for nothing, in part because he'd heard that the trustees of St Bartholomew's were about to pay an Italian artist to paint the picture, and because of his nationalism, he simply offered to paint it for nothing. And it was also, as a relatively low-born artist, it was his way of gaining great kudos really within the artistic establishment by having this wonderful kind of commission, even though he didn't get paid a penny for it. When I was a student in London, you could just walk in and see it. I don't think you can anymore. But it is well worth seeing. It goes all up the staircase of what used to be the administrative block of St Bartholomew's Hospital. So as I say, he satirized politicians, but he was at the same time intensely patriotic. He was clearly on the side of the Hanoverian dynasty as opposed to the Stuart dynasty. And in a sense, he's also been credited effectively with being the inventor of the storyboard, which of course is much used by filmmakers and all the rest of it today. You lay out all your pictures, telling the story before you actually go on to make the film or whatever else. He also was hugely influential on Stravinsky, who wrote an opera based on the Rake's Progress, and that's one of the reasons why I've chosen the Rake's Progress. I could have chosen any number of others that would have been just as interesting. But Stravinsky, who again was politically conservative but artistically radical, his Rake's Progress is nothing like as radical as the Rite of Spring. I mean, the Rite of Spring is an artistic work of genius, but Stravinsky himself, of course, was not a political radical at all. And of course, Hogarth himself was interested. He was influenced by John Gaye, and references to the Beggar's Opera and John Gaye crop up in Hogarth's works repeatedly. This is just to illustrate Hogarth's attitude towards the French, the attitude toward. So Hogarth here has actually put himself in the picture. I don't know whether you can see my little cursor circling around his head. This is Hogarth, and you can see the hand of somebody who's arresting him on his shoulder, and a halberd here by the soldier who's obviously arrested him. And he was arrested for drawing this picture of the gate in Calais, a gate which was actually demolished in the 19th century. Here, the French are always portrayed as skinny and malnourished and living on a diet of soup. This big lump of beef, the picture is actually called the Gate of Calais, but it's sometimes referred to as the roast beef of Old England. The big lump of beef that you see being carried by this scrawny person is being delivered to an English tavern. Calais was English and had an English influence right into the 18th century, and it was actually English right up until 1588. So this big lump of beef is being delivered to an English tavern in Calais, whilst these French people are living on a diet of soup and being superstitious and Catholic. Superstitious here, the people kind of worshipping this kind of strange fish, this big halibut, and a Franciscan friar is sort of trying to get his hands on this big lump of beef which is being delivered. In the meantime, down here in the corner is a refugee from the Jacobite uprising of 1745, subsisting on a diet of onions. So the old alliance between France and Scotland being derided thoroughly by William Hogarth. So Hogarth's experience of being arrested as a spy isn't he was anti-French before that, but he became even more anti-French afterwards. And so any kind of idea of French revolutionary ideas, of course, would have been absolutely derided by Hogarth. This is probably the most famous thing that people, if you show a picture of Gin Lane, I think most people would recognize if they recognize anything by Hogarth, it will be Gin Lane. What people often don't realize is it's part of a diptych. Oh, sorry. How do I get back? There we go. Part of a diptych. And again, there's a nationalist theme running through this. Here we have good English beer in Beer Street, and everybody here is fat and jolly and industrious, all busily working away whilst they also quaff some beer. The only place that's run down and ramshackle is the pawnbroker's shop, and even the pawnbroker can only afford a small beer handed through the door. Uh, in the meantime, everybody else is guzzling away and working industriously. And this is a tavern looking very kind of prosperous with a big barrel of beer being loaded up. So it's good English beer versus horrible gin. Gin, of course, was manufactured in London, London dry gin, but it was manufactured in London in part because there was an embargo on French brandy. In part because it was, and also, so in fact, the government of the day deliberately ended the monopoly on the Guild of Distillers in 1690 in order to facilitate the production of spirits. And that's carried on until the 1851 Gin Act. There really was a thing. And the production of gin was again, there is an implication that again this is something quite foreign in a way. The word gin, of course, is a contraction of Geneva, and gin became sometimes it's referred to as the gin plague or the gin craze of the 18th century, and you can see all around you absolute mayhem. Here is a madman who's got a skewered child on a stick. This poor woman has died, leaving her crying infant child on the ground. This man is reduced to the status of an animal sharing a bone with a dog. This man is so comatose that even a little snail can crawl up him. Here, the only place that's prosperous is the pawnbroker. And the pawnbroker is eyeing up the tools of this man's trade, which he's selling to buy gin. And this lady is selling the pots and pans to buy gin. This man down here has been reduced to being selling ballads about the extolling the virtues or otherwise of gin. And over the door here it says drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence, straw for nothing. And this lady here, her child drops to his death as she's completely oblivious while she takes snuff off her face on gin. A man hangs in this room at the back, and the distillers, which is called Killman Distillers, is doing a roaring trade, selling to children and all sorts. This was a real place, and we think this was a real place because that's what Hogarth used to do. Just as when he went to Calais, he went to Calais, he took advantage of a short lull in the fighting between Britain and France to go and paint the gate, to go and sketch the gate at Calais. And he almost certainly would have known places like this. This church spire is a building which is still there. It's St. George's, Bloomsbury. And this is effectively round the back of sort of New Oxford Street, that kind of area. When you walk along Oxford Street, of course, it looks, a place of big shops and quite prestigious sort of buildings and whatever. But actually, at the time, one of the reasons for the building of Oxford Street and New Oxford Street was to drive a big was slum clearance. It was to get rid of areas like this that had existed and were absolute dens of iniquity. So here is Beer Street and Gin Lane. It is a political allegory as well. The other reason, of course, why gin had become so popular was the government deliberately wanted to maintain the price of encourage the production of spirits to help maintain the price of corn. And corn, of course, was what Tory aristocrats, landowners produced. And so it was crucially related to maintaining a high price for corn. And one of the arguments for why the gin craze kind of ended with the 18th century was a rising price in grain. So the grain didn't need to be used to produce excess grain didn't need to be used to produce spirits. I'm now moving on to one of these kind of typical kind of morality tales of William Hogarth, and I've chosen the Rake's Progress. It's a particular favourite of mine, but it could have been any others. Um, I'm going to show you the engraved plates, but all of the engraved plates also have a portrait, have a painting as well. But Hogarth wasn't terribly interested in the paintings. He used them as a study on then which he then based the engravings, because that's how he made his money. And so this is Tom Rakewell. He has just come into a fortune from his miserly father, and this is his picture just above the fireplace. His father was an absolute miser, and we know he was an absolute miser. Down here, his father had obviously been making himself some new soles for his shoes by cutting it out of the cover of a Bible. And incidentally, when I talked about Hogarth's attitude towards religion, uh, Hogarth himself was a deist. He believed that God made the heavens and the earth, but then left humans to get on with it, really, and didn't interfere in the day-to-day efforts of human beings. He was also a Freemason, which is, I think, quite interesting because, again, Freemasonry at the time was a club for the aspiring bourgeoisie. Uh, it was often associated, for example, with the party of the Prince Regent, as opposed to King George III, who was, of course, very much rooted in the aristocracy, the Tory party. By contrast, the Whigs tended to support the Prince Regent, or at least some of them. Um, what Hogarth was doing by being a Freemason is sort of hitching his wagon, as it were, to the aspiring bourgeoisie, as opposed to the aristocracy. And of course, you see something similar with Mozart. The Magic Flute is full of Masonic references. Mozart was a Mason as well. So Tom Rakewell's miserly father has died. He's being measured here for a funeral suit. Here is Sarah Young, who's obviously a simple servant girl that he has impregnated. She's already heavily pregnant. Her mother here is raging at him. And this sort of scrawny cat here is scrawny because there's no bloody food in the house. And so there's probably no mice either. And in the meantime, this bloke here is putting Tom's affairs in order and helping himself to his money. And this theme of squandering his bourgeois father's hard-earned cash, hard-earned by being just simply a bloody miser. What you also see is, and they're very readable if you get a nice edition, is verse, and sometimes it's verse that's composed by Hogarth, and sometimes they're things taken from the Bible to emphasize the morality of what Hogarth is on about. This is plate 2 of the Rake's Progress. This is the levee. This is Tom Rakewell getting up in the morning, at sort of mid-morning. And he's surrounded by all these kind of hangers-on. This man here is actually a paid assassin that's been recommended to Tom Rakewell. So Tom Rakewell is actually in the business of hiring an assassin who can bump people off if he wants. Boris Johnson, take note. this here is a whole list of the presents he's given to Farinelli, the castrato singer, who was immensely famous at the time. Here is a jockey. Here is his fencing master, and his. Oh, and again, this is the other side of the French that's portrayed by Hogarth as overdressed, dandified, and pretty much useless. So, sorry. Yeah, so there he is, surrounded by all these hangers-on with some cheap, nasty art in the background and that kind of thing. There is a suggestion that this is Handel sitting sitting at the harpsichord here, and Tom Rakewell is paying the bills. Um, in the meantime, plate three. This is the orgy. This is him continuing to squander his money. This time on prostitutes and gaming and all the rest of it. Well, in particular, just lasciviousness. This lady has already taken off most of her clothes, ready to perform some sort of lewd act. Um, this this lady here is picking Tom Rakewell's pocket. This lady here is filling Tom Rakewell's glass with drink, despite the fact he's already paralytic, and receiving the watch that the prostitute has lifted from him. In the meantime, they've basically trashed the room. There is a suggestion that this was the Rose Tavern in Drury Lane, and really here, Hogarth is having a dig at the aristocracy as well, although he's a kind of he's come from a sort of bourgeois background. He's aspiring to aristocratic values, and that includes a complete disregard for the rule of law, because here we see a night watchman's lamp and staff, and he's a night watchman. He's probably casually wounded and disarmed. And here in the background is a woman who, obviously having been a prostitute and has now been made pregnant and can't do that anymore, is selling ballads. Obviously, this is a way in which the poorest often made their living. Here is a woman drinking a load of punch out of a bowl. Here's somebody spitting gin at someone else who's threatening them with a knife, and so it goes on. Another night out in London. Plate four, the arrest. Here is Tom Rakewell being arrested by the bailiff, and the only person who saves him is Sarah Young, who, despite all of everything that's gone between them, remains faithful to him and loves him, and hands over the money to the bailiff so he doesn't end up in a debtor's prison. Here, in the meantime, children are effectively learning to gamble. And here at the back is White's gaming house next to the court of St James's Palace. And the implication is, again, it's this association with sort of aristocracy, royalty, gaming, idleness, as opposed to healthy bourgeois values of thrift and industry. Now that his money's gone, the only way he can try to save himself from having to go and get a job or anything awful like that is to marry an old, ugly lady, and she will, support him in exchange for sexual favors and a supposedly slightly more aristocratic style of life. This is the sort of dilapidated-looking Church of St Marylebone in London. It's not, as some people think, Saint Mary Le Bon. It's not Saint Mary the Good. It's Saint Mary by the Bourne, and that's where we get the word Marylebone. So she's basically marrying her for her money. In the meantime, Sarah Young is being restrained from objecting to the wedding in the background, and the dog and the bitch here. And Hogarth does this in a number of places. He uses animals as a kind of a reflection of what's going on. So here's the dog and the bitch. Yeah, and church at the time was known as a place where you go and get married discreetly, as it were, because it wasn't a reputable church. It's a rather beautiful church if you go there now, because that's a 19th century version. This was painted. This was drawn in the late 18th. Sorry. 1730s, and Marylebone Church was demolished in 1740 and has been upgraded since. In the meantime, he now squanders her money as well. And here we see all these sort of moralistic rhymes at the bottom. Tom's gambling away another fortune. Here he is. Everybody's completely oblivious that the place is on fire. The night watchman comes in, here's his lamp and staff. He's like, yeah, bloody place is on fire. Everybody else is so engrossed in gambling and borrowing money to gamble some more at the card table that they haven't even noticed the place is on fire. And here is a highwayman, pistol in hand, pistol in his pocket, and a mask, sitting by the fire getting warm. And here's a usurer lending money for the next round of cards. And on the wall, this little notice up here on the wall is a reference to a royal charter, because the crown actually had a monopoly on the production of playing cards in England at the time. And that was one of the ways in which money was raised. So once again, we have this vice, which is being actively encouraged by the state, because the money from gaming cards goes directly into the treasury, just like the maintaining the high price of grain by encouraging people to make gin. Here is Tom Raithwell in the Fleet debtors' prison. He's now hunched over here. The jailer here is demanding money from him. Jailers generally extorted as much money from prisoners as they possibly could. This little boy here is trying to sell him beer, but he doesn't even have the money for the beer. And of course, beer is important in London, because it was a lot safer to drink than water. The brewing process helps to clean it up and get rid of the bugs that cause a lot of diarrheal type disease. You were much safer drinking beer. And so nurses at St. Thomas's Hospital were paid partly in beer. Soldiers and sailors were paid partly in beer, because you needed to be able to drink that to stay safe. Here is Sarah Young, absolutely distraught at the position that Raithwell's reduced himself to, and this is their daughter. And in the background, people are basically, the people who are in prison are already going mad. And there's a gin distillery. They're even brewing their own gin in prison. And I can assure you, from my experience at Durham Prison, the same thing still goes on. So Tom is now too poor to pay for the garnish. And you could even pay to have sort of slightly lighter fetters. If you pay a bit more, you don't get such big chains around your legs. In the Beggar's Opera, Macheath talks about the fact that he can scarcely afford to be in prison. And here, finally, the 8th plate from the Rake's Progress is in Bedlam. And we know it's Bedlam. Bedlam, of course, is a contraction of St. Mary of Bethlehem. And if you want to know where this was, it's Finsbury Circus. If you go to Finsbury Circus today, that's where that was the second hospital to carry the name of St. Mary of Bethlehem. The first one is roughly where Liverpool Street Station is today, and that was the original priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem. And of course, as I say, Bedlam is a contraction of that. We know this is the syphilitic ward. We know this is the ward for people who are incurable. This is Sarah. She's the only one who's kind of stood by him throughout all of this. And Tom has gone mad with a kind of syphilitic dementia, which is affectionately known as general paralysis of the insane. One of the interesting features of syphilitic dementia is it causes delusions of grandeur. And we see here in the background, there is a man who thinks he's a king. You can't really tell from this print, but he's actually pissing. In the meantime, 2 well-dressed ladies here have paid their penny to go and see the lunatics at Bedlam for the day. And in the grounds of Bedlam, there were stalls selling beer and cakes. It's only a matter of time. And in the meantime, here is a man who thinks he's the Pope. And this poor sad man is probably has a melancholic depression, a melancholic disposition. And what you can't see in the painting, and this is the thing that got me, if you want to see the paintings of this, they're at the St. John Soanes Museum. in London. The engravings are often more detailed, and in fact, on the banister here, on the balustrade, is Charming Betty Careless engraved, probably by this man. Charming Betty Careless is a reference to an infamous and very beautiful London prostitute of the time, and undoubtedly that's where he caught the syphilis that sent him mad. There is a sort of scar there, which is possibly an implication of self-harm, but also possibly an implication of a syphilitic ulcer. Here is somebody who is absolutely delusional because he's got delusions of grandeur that he's going to win the money from in the competition for £1,000 to discover the basis of longitude. Here is somebody seized with a religious mania and so on. The jailer here shows a lot more attention to Sarah than he does to his charge. The important thing to understand here as well is that Bedlam at the time, like all the madhouses of the day, these were not medical institutions. They were places for simply the containment of the poor and indigent. This is not a medical institution in any reasonable way. And there he is, poor Tom Rakewell. And so you get this morality play. This is where dissolution and departing from the bourgeois ideals of hard work and thrift get you. Which brings me neatly on to the Beggar's Opera. This was painted by William Hogarth. It was Act 3, Scene 11 of the Beggar's Opera, in which the jailer here, Locket, and you can tell that he's got his keys there, and this is his daughter, Lucy Locket, and back again. Oh, bloody hell. That's what happens when you use your cursor as a pointer. Yeah, so this is the inside of Newgate Jail. This, of course, stood where the Old Bailey stands today. This scene, there's this famous scene where Lucy Locket and Polly Peachum confront one another, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But the Beggar's Opera was produced in 1728. John Gaye wrote the libretto, but the music was largely based upon ballads. It was a ballad opera. What's unusual about the Beggar's Opera is it has no recitative. So so instead of people singing when they're trying to talk to one another, this kind of stuff, there's normal dialogue and punctuated by ballads. So it's a ballad opera, and everybody would have known the songs. Everybody would have known the tunes. In fact, John Gaye wasn't originally going to have a musical accompaniment at all. He was going to have the singers singing unaccompanied, because that's what balladeers did. Balladeers sung without accompaniment, but the German musician Johann Christoph Pepusch actually arranged the music and a relatively short notice before it went on stage, and thereby ensured its success. So John Gaye really wrote the libretto. Pepusch arranged the music, and the music was largely ballads that were widely known throughout 18th century London. It premiered on the 29th of January 1728 in Lincoln's Inn Fields Theatre, and the owner of the theatre and producer was John Rich. And of course, this produced some wag commented that the Beggar's Opera made Gay rich and Rich gay. John Rich later went on to use the enormous profits that came from the Beggar's Opera to build a new theatre. He built the Theatre Royal Covent Garden, which stood now where the Royal Opera House does. The original theatre burnt down and was eventually replaced by the Royal Opera House, but the Theatre Royal Covent Garden was built with the profits made from the Beggar's Opera. And it ran longer than any other production at the time. It was, as it were, the mousetrap of its day. And it has been successfully produced many times ever since. This is what we think of as a picture of John Gaye. It has been subsequently speculated that that's John Gaye, but we're not quite sure. But John Gaye, again, was politically quite conservative, but artistically radical. What we see in the Beggar's Opera is an absolutely savage lampooning of the political establishment of the day. John Gay himself came from a religiously nonconformist family. He was a friend of those other great satirists, Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope. He was associated with the Whiggish types that hung around the Prince Regent. He made quite a lot of money, but lost it all in the bubble, the so-called South Sea bubble of 1720, where the South Sea Company, which had a monopoly on, for example, trading in slaves in the South Seas, in the South Sea Islands, um, among other things, collapsed because it was basically a Ponzi scheme. But John Gay, despite the fact he's lampooned politicians left, right, and centre, didn't seem to come off too badly. He was provided a home effectively by the Duke of Queensberry. He was given a sinecure and £150 a year. Again, quite a comfortable sum of money, considering he had free accommodation as well. As of all things, a lottery commissioner. And for a while, he even had rooms in the Whitehall Palace before it was demolished. And so that was John Gay. So the main characters in the Beggar's Opera, I'm going to come on to now, and we'll play a few little clips from the Beggar's Opera. There are lots of versions of the Beggar's Opera. I've got at least three, but there are quite a number of them available on YouTube. And one of my particular favorites, and the one I've chosen, features a production by that other great satirist, Dr. Jonathan Miller, who was, of course, responsible for Beyond the Fringe, which had such a big influence on Monty Python and a whole range of other things. So Jonathan Miller, that other great satirist, produced a version of the Beggar's Opera with, of all people, Roger Daltrey of The Who, cast as Macheath. There is a 1955 version of the Beggar's Opera starring Sir Laurence Olivier as Macheath, and he's the most unconvincing Macheath you're ever going to see. But there are lots of other very good versions out there. There's a nice one conducted by Bonning, which has got Warren Mitchell as the beggar. So the play starts off with the beggar. It is an opera written by a beggar. I own myself as a company of beggars and make one at their weekly festival at St. Giles, the beggar announces. And he goes on to say that he has a dinner there whenever he pleases, which is more than most poets can say, he goes on. Who we then meet is Mr. Peachum, and Mr. Peachum is a receiver of stolen goods. And moreover, he's the person who runs all the highwaymen and the thieves and the pickpockets. So he runs the highwaymen and the thieves and the pickpockets, and they steal the goods that he then fences. And then, in the event that he falls out with them, or they get it wrong, or they don't bring in enough money, he sells them for the reward. And he sells them for the reward of £40. If you could actually prove that you had caught a thief, you got a bounty from the state of £40, and that allowed him to live very comfortably indeed. And Peachum was effectively playing both sides throughout, and we'll see in the various clips that I'm about to show you of what he's up to. So Peachum is a receiver of stolen goods. And as we'll see, through all the employments of life, each neighbour abuses his brother. And he goes on to say how people try to compare themselves with him. Even a statesman thinks he's so great because his trade's as honest as mine. So Tina, if we could play the first clip, I'd be grateful. Tina? Is it there? We got it?
The employments of life, each neighbor abuses his brother. Whore and rogue they call husband and wife. All professions berode one another. The priest calls a lawyer a cheat. the lawyer by name divine, and the statesman because he's so great, thinks his trade as honest as mine.
I don't know whether people can see that.
The lawyer's an honest employment, so is mine.
Sorry, did that not work?
Well, all I can see is my PowerPoint slide. I don't know whether I need to stop sharing or something.
Did comrades see this? I tried to share it at the same time. Did comrades were able to see the video of the opera? Yes, we saw it. Okay, so it's maybe
great.
you're not
Fantastic.
seeing it.
So here's Peacham, comparing, say, even a statesman, because he's so great, thinks his trade's as honest as mine. A fence and somebody who who runs criminals. The other characters are Mrs. Peacham. There's Polly Peacham, their daughter, who surreptitiously marries Captain Macheath, and marries here is a bit of a euphemism. There's a point in which Mrs. Peacham is furious because she's gone and married Captain Macheath. And this has caused alarm in all sorts of ways. Firstly, what they probably wanted to do was auction off her virginity to someone more suitable to advance their position. And secondly, so it meant that she was ruined from that point of view. It also meant that Macheath knows too much. And note the name Macheath, son of the heath. This is the man he's a highwayman. And then at one point, Mrs. Peacham is railing against him. Could you introduce nobody into our family but a highwayman? Why, thou foolish jade, thou wilt be as ill used and much neglected as if thou hadst married a lord. And then Peacham is also absolutely incensed. He says, highwaymen are generally very good at their whores, but they're the very devils to their wives. And so there's widespread disapproval. So can we have the second clip, please, Tina?
Yeah, I think I might have to switch yours off then, because people, not everybody was able to see it. Hold on a second.
Okay.
I'll do it like this. Oh, hold on.
A maid is like the golden ore which hath guineas insensible hint, whose worth is never known before it is tried in a fixed hint. A wife's like a kidney in gold, stuck with the midnight's pulse. So that is clean in every Come here, Phil. I'm as fond of this child as though my mind misgave me he were my own. He hath as fine a hand for picking a pocket as a woman, and is as nimble-fingered as a juggler. Oh, Filch, if an unlucky session doth not cut the rope of thy life, I pronounce, boy, thou wilt be a great man in history. Where was your post last night, my boy?
I applied at the opera, madam. Considering 'twas neither dark nor rainy, so that there was no great hurry in getting chairs and coaches, well, I made a tolerable end on't. These 7 attitudes, madam.
Oh, coloured ones, I see. These are of shore sailed from our warehouse at Redriff among the seamen.
And the snuff box.
Set in gold. Pretty encouragement this for a young beginner.
I bet I got a charming gold watch.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, pops take the tailors for making a fob so deep and narrow.
Oh.
I stopped by the way and I was forced to make my escape under a coach.
Oh.
Really, madam, I fear I shall be cut off in the flower of my youth, so that every now and then I've had thoughts of taking up and going to sea.
No. No, you should go to Hockley in the Hole and to Marybone, child, to learn valour. These are the schools that have bred so many brave men. I thought by this time, boy, thou hadst lost fear as well as shame. Poor lad, how little doth he as yet know of the Old Bailey. For the first fact, I'll insure thee from being hanged, and going to sea Filch will come time enough upon a sentence of transportation. But now, since you've nothing better to do, go to your book and learn your catechism. For really a man makes but an ill figure in the ordinary's paper who cannot give a satisfactory answer to his questions. Oh, Kimberly, don't tell me a lie. Do you know I hate a lie? Do you know of anything that has passed between Captain McKeith and Aunt Polly?
I beg you, madam, don't ask me. For I must either tell a lie to you or to Miss Polly, and I promised her I would not tell.
But where the honour of our family is
I
concerned.
should lead a sad life for Miss Polly if ever she comes to know that I told you. Besides, I would not willingly forfeit my own honour by betraying anybody.
Yonder comes my husband and Polly. Come filch with me to my own room and tell me the whole story. Give the Agnes the most delicious cordial that I keep for my own drinking.
So there we have Mrs. Peacham, and she gets Filch to tell them the story. All the kind of criminals, the prostitutes, the rest of it, have names that are redolent of their occupation. So they've got names like Filch and Nimming Ned. Nimmings was a name for thieving. And the prostitutes the same. So you've got Jenny Tawdry and Dolly Trull and all these other names that tell exactly what they do. And of course, Captain McHeath, we don't know what he was a captain of, but he was just simply a captain. Has married Polly Peacham, and as it turns out, he's also married later Lucy Lockett, but we'll see more of that later. So now we'll meet Captain McHeath and with Polly Peacham. Tina, if you could have the third clip, I'll be grateful. And here, just note the song Over the Hills and Far Away, which is one of the few songs where the tune is still widely known in Britain today.
He stays his hand, and then he's lost forever. He intended to lie concealed in my room to the dusk of the evening. If they're abroad, I'll this instant let him out, lest some accident should prevent him.
Pretty Polly sang when I was away. Did your fancy never strike to some new lover?
Cloudy skies, weaving songs through the arms, my constant heart discover. Oh, let me love.
Oh, pretty Polly.
Oh, you as fond as ever, my dear.
It's anything but my love. This fine more with her shoulder while I am pursued, if I ever think.
Nay, my dear, I've no reason to doubt you. I find in the romance you lent me none of the great heroes was ever false in love.
My heart was so free, it flowed like the bee, till Polly my passion requited. My heart was so free, it flowed like the bee, till Polly my passion requited. I sipped each flower, I changed every hour. I sipped each flower, I changed every hour. But here every flower is united. I sipped each flower, I changed every hour. I sipped each flower, I changed every hour. But here every flower is united.
Oh, were you sentenced to transportation? Sure, my dear, you could not leave me behind him, could you?
Any power, any force that could tear thee from me? Or you might sooner tear a pension out of the hands of a courtier, a fee from a lawyer, a pretty woman from a looking glass, or any woman from a quadrille. To tear thee from me is impossible.
Were I laid on Greenland's coast, and in my arms embrace my lads, warm amidst eternal frost, too soon the half year's night would pass.
In soil, soon as the burning evening had closed, I want London's country when on my charmer's and I would love you all the time. That would kiss and it would make you fondly stride over the hills and far away. Oh, yes, I would go with thee. How shall I speak it? I must be torn from thee. We must part. How art? We must. My papa and ma are set against thy life. But they now even are in depends upon a moment. Yes, my love should float and bring it to the favored heart. Let me tell thee from my bleeding heart, my hands are Yes, death, my love should swoon and bring to the heart. Let me tell thee from my being heart, thy hands and leave Be gone. Farewell. My arm again. So riveted to mine. Must have come in and set thee, and then I should lose the very glimmering of hope. A few weeks perhaps may reconcile us all. Shall I hear from thee? Let it go. Will not absence change your love? Love it. Stay and behave. Oh, how I fear. I Oh, no. Leave. Leave us. An absence will give me leave. You will be sure to see me again. Will you just... No. Until then, Polly is wretched. The minds of us a shilling seat, which he's obliged to pay. With sighs resigns it by degrees, and fears he's gone for aye. The boy thus when his sparrow was flew, the bird in silent eyes. For soon as the sight is gone, winds wimble soft and clear.
So McKeith then takes himself off to square matters with the gang because he can't go and join them out on the road. And at the same time, as soon as they've gone off to go and carry out their various robberies, he then takes himself off to a tavern to be entertained by lots of women that he sent for, some from as far as Hockley in the Hole. And if anybody wants to know where that used to be, it's roughly near where Farringdon Tube Station is. And so, as he says, a miser might as well be happy with 1 guinea as I with 1 woman. So he's playing Polly Peachum, and as later on we go to find out that he's also married Lucy Lockett, one of the prostitutes that he goes off to see after being with Polly Peachum. Two of them betray him to the law, and he gets arrested and taken off to Newgate prison. While in Newgate, he's subject to garnish. He has to pay the jailer and all sorts of other things. And he also then encounters Lucy Lockett, who's also pregnant by Macheath, and whom he's also married. And later on, there's a famous confrontation between Polly and Lucy Lockett. And everybody at the time, everybody would have known that this would have been a direct reference to a fight, effectively, that broke out between two opera divas at the time, Francesca Cuzzoni and Faustina Bordoni, in the King's Theatre Haymarket in 1727. So it was a fresh, direct reference to that fight between these divas. And throughout the opera, there are these. It's a satire of English society, but it's also a satire of opera itself. It's a satire of English society and of its corruption. So, for example, when Mrs. Peachum confronts Mr. Peachum about the list of people he's planning to have killed next in order to claim the reward, one of the people that's mentioned is somebody called Bob Booty. Everyone in the audience would have known that Bob Booty was a direct reference to Robert Walpole, the then Prime Minister, who was known for taking bribes. So what you see then is a satire, a political satire, and a satire of opera, and one which, in the final analysis, has at its very heart that the rich commit crimes, the poor commit crimes, but only the poor are punished for them. And I don't know whether you can still see the PowerPoint presentation, but there was a picture of the idle apprentice executed at Tyburn. The Tyburn tree was a sort of triangular structure that stood roughly where Marble Arch stands today in London. And there was a direct route from Newgate Prison to Tyburn via Holborn and what is now New Oxford Street and down that way. And along the way, drawn in a cart, and eventually the rope would be put around the back of around the man's neck under the Tyburn tree, and the cart's just simply driven away, and he was left to dangle there. It wasn't a case of him dropping and having a swift death from having his neck broken. It was a case of being slowly strangled under the Tyburn tree. The population of London at the time was around 600,000, and anything up to 10% were engaged in some sort of criminal activity at one time or another. And if you look at the picture of the idle apprentice executed at Tyburn, you can even see pickpocketing going on in the crowd of the people who are watching the people who are being executed. And bearing in mind, all you had to do to be executed was to steal something of the value of a shilling. Bearing in mind that £40 a year was an average wage for a worker, a shilling isn't very much. So, for example, Filch in stealing a handkerchief will be transported to Botany Bay. For stealing a gold snuff box would certainly have been hanged. And the other thing about all of this, about the Beggar's Opera, is that it was a direct reference to people who they would have known. There were real figures in recent history that Macheath and Peachum were based upon. So, for example, Jonathan Wild, the so-called thief-taker general, was doing exactly what Peachum did, and he was hanged for that in 1725. The idea of the gentleman, lovable rogue highwayman was a figure created by the Frenchman Claude Duval, who was executed in 1690. And despite the fact that he was a popular figure who abhorred violence and tended to treat his victims with some respect. And Jack Sheppard is also a kind of a figure around which Macheath could have been based, because Macheath escapes from Newgate Prison because he gets Lucy Lockett to help him get out. But Jack Sheppard actually escaped from prison four times. He was only hanged after being imprisoned the fifth time. He escaped twice from Newgate Prison, which was widely reckoned to be almost impossible. These were based upon real people, and everybody in the audience would have known it and understood it. So the main theme is, as I say, that the rich and poor carry out the same crimes, but it's the poor that get punished for them. And as we see in this final clip, Macheath rails against it's a wonder we don't keep better company on Tyburn Hill.
Since laws were made for every degree to curb vice in others as well as me, I wonder we had better company upon Tyburn Tree. Since laws were made for every degree to curb vice in others as well as me, I wonder we had better company upon Tyburn Tree. But gold from law can take out the sting, and if rich men like us were to swing, twould thin out the land, such numbers to string upon Tyburn Tree. But gold from law can take out the sting, and if rich men like us were to swing, twould thin out the land, such numbers to string upon Tyburn Tree.
Thank you. Can I get back to the PowerPoint? Not much more to show. But...
You'd need to press share again if you want to show it again.
Okay. Where's the share? There we go. So yes, gold from law can take out the sting, and eventually Macheath, when he gets recaptured and ends up basically Lockett and Peacham decide to split the reward for hanging him, and also share out his wealth, and eventually they're confronted. And eventually Macheath is confronted not only by Lucy and Holly, but four other women carrying his children, and says, "I'm ready to hang." And the beggar says, "Well, that's it. You know, that's the end of the story. He'll hang." And you can't end with a sad story like that. You know, the beggar insists. This shows that it's the poor that pay the price for crime, whereas the rich get away with it. But eventually the beggar is persuaded that he'll soften it, and if somebody cries reprieve, and Macheath gets away with it and ends up living happily ever after with Polly. Nonsense, of course, as all opera indeed is. And of course, that's just the point. It's a satire of opera and British society at the same time. And this is the idle apprentice. Industry and idleness is another one of these morality tales by William Hogarth, and this is Tyburn Tree, this triangular structure here, and here's the cart with the condemned man and his coffin in the cart. The influence of the Beggar's Opera has been enormous. Not only has there been innumerable versions of it, from Benjamin Britten through to the film version in 1955, which is worth watching for a laugh, to other more memorable ones, such as the one by Sir Malcolm Sargent. And of course, it was hugely influential on Bertolt Brecht, who turned it into the Threepenny Opera. And also there's a threepenny novel as well by Bertolt Brecht. So Bertolt Brecht wrote the libretto for the Beggar's Opera, for the threepenny opera, but he didn't just do it on his own. What's often overlooked is that it was Elizabeth Hauptmann who translated the English Beggar's Opera into German. And that's how Bertolt Brecht came across it at all. And so without Elizabeth Hauptmann, it would never have happened. And moreover, Bertolt Brecht was trying to sell some other theatre project to a theatre owner who turned him down. And so Bertolt Brecht says, well, what about this? And showed him the translation of The Beggar's Opera by Elizabeth Hauptmann. And that subsequently became a highly successful opera, opening in Berlin in 1928. And the libretto was by Bertolt Brecht, and Kurt Weill wrote the music, and of course it was an allegory of capitalism. So all I've been really trying to say is that sometimes the politically conservative produce radical art and produce great satire. And if anyone's interested in taking this a little further and wants to look at some references, you can buy The Beggar's Opera, the whole libretto by John as a Penguin classic. Lucy Moore has written a kind of history of the Beggar's, not of the opera itself, but of 18th century London and the people like, for example, Jack Sheppard and Jonathan Wild in particular. And if anyone wants to read a history of that period, and again, this is the little detail from a Hogarth picture of the idle apprentice being hanged. Peter Linebaum's book is a Marxist analysis of that period in London, and looking at the way in which the coming into being of capitalism posed such a profound social was in absolutely phenomenal numbers. So Peter Linebaum's book, The London Hanged, is to be richly recommended. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, Ian. Brilliant, really interesting. Thank you for taking your time as well to show us examples, etc. Comrades, if anybody's got any questions or comments, please click raise hand and I can bring you in. Just a couple of questions or comments more like, this is interesting when you mentioned at the end there as well, the transition. Obviously, this is both things were written in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and that is reflected in who society's taking, i.e. is taking the side of the rising bourgeoisie, the rising capitalist against the feudalist, but also against the poor. And I just wonder, sort of are we taking the mickey out of poor people? Are we, saying this is, we have to overcome all of this, the feudal lords, but also these, this terrible poverty, which is of course caused by rising capitalism, and it is caused by, the proletarialization of the peasantry. They had to come to the towns. They were impoverished, yet they had to sell their labor power. They couldn't live on the land anymore. It's also the charity issue, isn't it? These poor foundlings, etc. Yep, it was capitalism producing them. The impoverishment there. So are we taking the mickey out of poor people? I get the impression, and that's certainly in Brecht's versions of it, we don't, we identify with the poor, really. Hogarth, on the other hand, that seems to be more like a sort of, look at them, how terrible are they? We don't want that. We want capitalism to help us from that, which is of course ludicrous, as I say, because it produced it. How do you see this? Because it did remind me in parts of Little Britain, which I hate with a passion. They are taking the mickey out of poor people, aren't they? These two comedians. It's a terrible, terrible, horrible show. But it reminded me in parts of that. How do you see that tension there?
Yeah, I mean, Hogarth is a moralist, and he's saying you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and that's the only. And I'm not pretending for one moment that William Hogarth is a progressive figure, except with relation to the feudal aristocracy. He's not for one moment suggesting that somehow all of this could be transcended in any way, uh, and he's actually seeing the whole thing in terms of moral degeneracy, really. A moral degeneracy a moral degeneracy following not only from licentiousness and idleness, but also from a want of industry, and he's very much on the side of industry as opposed to. I mean, if I'd shown you industry and idleness, for example, what you end up with is two apprentices. One takes the kind of hard-working, diligent route and eventually ends up as an alderman, as the Justice of the Peace, and eventually Lord Mayor of London. The other one ends up consorting with prostitutes and ended up going to sea to escape the law, and then eventually coming back to take up criminality and end up being hanged by the very other apprentice who had got himself into the position of being a justice of the peace. So there is nothing politically progressive really about Hogarth's morality tales from our perspective. What I think it does, though, in just the same way as if you read Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, you look into this, you peer into the underbelly of the capitalist beast in a sense, and you see the horror that it throws up. So forget the musical Oliver that makes Fagin out to be a sort of a lovable rogue. Fagin is a horrible character who runs poor children to commit crimes and that sort of thing. And in so do, I mean, and Hogarth, like Dickens, isn't necessarily always presenting the poor in a good light. Very far from it. And again, the solution from Hogarth's point of view is charity and hard work.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? It's a transition period, clearly, like and art exploded, and lots of different types of art exploded, and a bit like after the Russian Revolution, perhaps, when things change so dramatically, creativity goes through the roof, and all sorts of people do all sorts of things, and playing with politics as well. I mean, Shakespeare is another person we've looked at him, and we'll get back to him as well. It's also interesting you mentioned he was concerned with earning money, Hogarth, and the paintings he didn't do quite so much, because presumably you do one painting and that's it. Whereas if you do engravings, you can sell them over and over and over again. Sort of the capitalization of art. That's quite interesting. And his fight for copyright laws, which he introduced, reminded me of today. Like Banksy, he's purposefully not taking any copyright money, etc. So there is the linkage between commercialization of art and sort of the artistic integrity is quite stark there in this example. So what did he do about the copyright? Did he sort of ask the king or what, or the lords, to the capitalists to introduce?
Yes, sorry. With help from people like Swift and Pope, he had a certain amount of political influence, and as I say, himself actually became a sergeant painter, a weird kind of title, and so he had a certain amount of pull. Not as much as Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was, of course, knighted, but nevertheless. There is something interesting about that. There is something interesting about that tension between Sir Joshua Reynolds, who didn't like Hogarth's portraiture, but this is a time of the commodification of art writ large, really. Although John Gaye, for example, had aristocratic patronage, Hogarth didn't. except insofar as you got that sinecure from the king. And so we're moving away from aristocratic patronage in favor of the full commodification of art. And of course, you get the same theme in Mozart's work. You know, the Magic Flute was a commercial piece of work, and it had nothing to do with being sponsored by an aristocrat. And Mozart hated the aristocracy too. That's what you see being lampooned in the Barber of Seville and so on. So there is that theme running through various artists of the time. And it is the commodification of art. And in a sense, that's terrible. But on the other hand, it sets the artist free. So instead of having to do commissions for this or that lord, painting them in a flattering way, for example, you can paint all sorts of things with all sorts of subjects, even if it upsets people. And the nice thing about Hogarth, I think, is even now, I think when people look at something like Gin Lane, it still has the capacity to shock, and especially when they find out that it was a real place and this stuff was really going on.
It's also linked a little bit to the making politicians professional and earning money that came later, though. But it's kind of linked, isn't it? For a long time, parliamentarians had to be like rich because you didn't get paid, and then sort of starting them to get paid allows the bourgeoisie to enter parliament, etc. Agnes has got a question or a comment. Nice to see you, comrade.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
So you can hear me now. Wonderful.
Yes.
So Ian, thank you so much. As always, you were brilliant. And also it was highly entertaining. So I was having a really good time. And I very much enjoyed your recitative, your demonstration of the recitative. I thought that was a great piece of singing. So I'd just like to add something to your presentation, if it's okay. So Nina de Valois, who was the founder of the Royal Ballet, she created a piece of ballet on the Rake's Progress on Hogarth's paintings, like about 10 or 15 years before Stravinsky wrote his opera. The Stravinsky opera is long. This ballet by Nina de Valois is short. I think it was just like one act. And it was performed quite a lot of the time, about 52 years ago. And the reason I know it, because I was principal cellist in that ballet company at that time. And I remember playing it quite a lot. I didn't get to see too much of the stage, but I still remember a dancer called David Morse. I just see him in front of my eye now, or in my brain. He was the rake. He was Tom Rakewell. And as far as I could see from the pit, he was very good. So I don't know why they don't play that ballet all that often these days, or whether they play it at all. I think it should be in the Royal Ballet repertoire. I might be talking rubbish now because perhaps they are playing it, but I'm not aware. Anyway, I just wanted to add Nina de Valois' ballet based on the Rake's Progress on Hogarth's plates, and that was about 15 years. I think it was 1935. So it was 15 or 20 years before Stravinsky actually completed his opera. So that's what I wanted to say. I hope you don't mind.
Not at all. Thank you very
And
much.
thank you so much. Brilliant. Lovely. Made me happy.
That's good. We aim to please. If anybody else has got any comments or questions, please click raise hand. Ian, just a question in the chat there as well, which is kind of interesting because Brecht, obviously, who took the opera and made it into German and had to, slightly different musical score, obviously by Kurt Weill. But he was obviously a sort of, a socialist, pro-worker, etc. And he staged it, a few, well, 100 years, over 100 years later. When you compare the two, I mean, he, as you say, he actually based it on the translation of Elizabeth Hauptmann. They didn't change much, did they? But is it the context of showing it that made it like a pro-worker thing? Had things moved on so much, or how do you see that as a, is it a progressive piece of art as opposed to something that sort of more taking a Mickey at different time?
I think so. Well, firstly, both Brecht and Weill were explicitly communists, so they knew whose side they were on. I think it was a stroke of genius in a sense to transpose it into a more modern idiom, because the tensions that you can see in the society of Hogarth's day and of John Gay's day are more fully realized in Berlin of 1928. Not only when by then you've already got capitalism in decline, as manifested by the rise of fascism, and of course the idea of thugs with knives kind of ruling the place was a very real feature, and again, a very kind of committed cast, committed to making a point with art. Generally speaking, I find some tendentious art, anyone who's actually sat through kind of excruciating overtly political poems or something like that, which might be worthy enough in themselves, but are not necessarily always great art. But I think the Threepenny Opera is a great piece of art, which is tendentious, but remains a great piece of art because it does talk about the tensions that are there at the time. Of course, Brecht, in the end, to a certain extent, you could say, well, maybe sold out by taking up a state post in the GDR, but nevertheless, I'm grateful to the work that he's done. I mean, not just the Threepenny Opera, but Mother Courage and Her Children and all these other great plays are always well worth visiting.
As I understand, he was rather conflicted about it as well as you would if you're in East Germany and Soviet Union, etc. Fantastic. Yes, of course. Come on in.
So sorry, just to add, I wasn't sure if I can have another go. It's about the music, the original, and then the Kurt Weill one. So the original was based on ballads, and it was a ballad opera because that was popular at the time. And by the time we reach Kurt Weill's time, beginning of 20th century, jazz came about, and jazz was Afro-American and very revolutionary. And Kurt Weill's score has a lot of jazzy element in it. So, in other words, I think that the Threepenny Opera is just as relevant to our time, I mean 1928, as John Gay's and Pepusch's ballad opera was at that time. Anyway, and Kurt Weill is great.
I agree, and it was an interesting thing that there was a 1930 production in Moscow of the Threepenny Opera, and of course by this time the Soviet Union was deeply in the grip of Stalinism, and it was slated. This was a time when things like jazz were already beginning to be attacked as degenerate art, a kind of a mirroring of the attitude of the Nazis towards jazz. It's interesting how jazz had the capacity to disconcert those in power, whether they were fascists or Stalinists.
Thank you very much. Very good final words for this session. Thank you, comrade. That was really a very outstanding opening and discussion. Thank you very much, comrades, for attending. You will have seen from our email, we are planning on shaking things a little bit up in 2025. We're getting together with some other groups to discuss in a series of joint events. It's working title, Building a Communist Party in the 21st Century, where we want to look at various aspects related to that. But we'll also continue our Communist Culture Club. So every 2 weeks, we're going to have another session. So if you have a subject you would like to introduce, please get in touch. Email info@ymarks.com. Agnes, I'm still waiting for another one of yours.
Yeah.
You were toying something.
Yeah, I just did something on Sunday. I'm doing something else on Monday, and then an in-person Holocaust presentation in Budapest in December. So kind
We're
of,
full up for December, I get it.
yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
We're full up anyway, so but 2025 is around the corner, so
Oh yeah, that's
doing more
fine.
sessions then.
That's
So
great
that'll
because
be-
it's got 12 months in it. So yeah, I can commit for the 2025. Not
Oh,
necessarily the topic you asked me, but I've got various other topics
very good.
on offer
Excellent,
in
excellent.
2025.
Yes, indeed. So if anybody else would like to present something in the Communist Culture Club, so get in touch and we'd love to hear from you. We'll see you next week. We'll take another look at imperialism, I believe. And so we're finishing this year, and we're finishing our sub-series on imperialism with a few sessions in between, and then we're starting something new in 2025. Good evening, comrades. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye.